We have moments in our lives. Sometimes we know them as we walk into that moment. Sometimes we don't know that it was that moment until much, much later. Sometimes even decades afterwards, that we finally remember that moment. That moment when things shifted in big ways from one direction to another. Our way of seeing ourselves, our loved ones, the world around us changed. About 15 years ago, the term tipping point really gained a lot of movement in America. It was Malcolm Gladwell's first book among inviting people to see the world a little bit differently. And what he said about tipping points is that tipping points remind us that the ways in the world and the way we see ourselves and the world around us, progress isn't linear. Change doesn't happen bit by bit, moment by moment all the time, but there's a moment when there's enough energy or movement around a thing or a group or an idea or something that it tips the scales in the other direction, and all of a sudden we're on a new path. One of the examples he uses in that book is penny loafers. Does anyone remember penny loafer shoes? Well, a whole bunch of years ago, there were almost no penny loafers being sold. Like they were about ready to die out. Maybe under 100 were sold each year. 2 years later, they were back as one of the most popular dress shoes in the world. And we didn't know exactly why, except he noticed that a few, we'd call them hipsters today, well, they started wearing penny loafers without socks. And the next thing you knew, these shoes were taken off again. What was that tipping point? No one could have predicted what the tipping point was going to be. But it happened. Today, in this gospel from Mark, we have a tipping point. You see, Jesus has been doing things. In fact, these words in our gospel are exactly halfway through Mark's gospel. Literally, when Peter responds and says, "You are the Messiah," there are the same number of words before that line as after in this gospel. Intentionality there. We have this tipping point. Jesus has been teaching and preaching and calling people to follow him. He's been performing miracles. He's been feeding thousands of people. He's been doing all of these amazing things. And the crowds are getting bigger, and then they get smaller, then they get bigger again. And so here's Jesus and the crowds and his closest disciples. And they're in a place called Caesarea Philippi, which is a Roman place where the Romans were in power. And in the middle of Caesarea Philippi, there are all these little places, these little niches, these little spots where images of the Roman gods are all around them. So they're walking in this garden with these niches around them, and imagine Jesus wanting to get somewhere with his disciples. It's time to have a new way. So Jesus, in the midst of this place of connection to God, says to his followers, we know the easy question first, right? Who do people say that I am? That's easier. Some say John the Baptist. Others, Elijah. Others, one of the prophets. But then it gets real. And Jesus, I imagine, kind of does a little eye contact thing with all of his disciples. Who do you say that I am? And the one who's always quick to answer, the one who speaks for the rest of them, Peter, very quickly says, "You are the Messiah." Messiah. There was not one definition of Messiah in Jesus' day, but they thought, as good Jewish people, that the Messiah was going to be the one who was going to come and in some way reclaim that land, the promised land called holy for the Jewish people, and kick the Romans out and have it back in power of the Jewish people. So the Messiah was going to come and do big and great things, basically mostly militarily. And Jesus flips Messiah and says, yeah, all right, but here's what that means. It means that thing back there, that had certain meanings. That cross, well, the cross is going to mean a whole new thing. And I'm going to walk this way to death and new life and be handed over and betrayed, and it's going to change everything. Let's talk about the cross. The Romans used the cross. They used the cross to say, if you don't do what we want you to do, you'll be there. As a means of power and coercion and intimidation. And Jesus takes that power, intimidation, and coercion, takes this thing of rules, turns it into the way we see it today. The cross being God's ultimate sign of love for you and for me and for all the world. Messiah didn't mean military power. Cross didn't mean intimidation and coercion. Cross meant Jesus and his unconditional, radical love for you and me and everybody else. Talk about a giant tipping point in the way people saw God, saw themselves, and saw the world. It wasn't an immediate tip. It took some time. But we're sitting here because we believe in the redemptive power of the cross. We believe that in Jesus and his life, death, and resurrection, something tipped, something changed. And our whole understanding of ourselves and our neighbors in the world got flipped upside down. In this reading that Mary read from James, we hear about a bit and a rudder and a small fire. We hear about how these small things have power over much bigger things. I don't know a lot about horses, but one of the things that I do think I remember is that when you first try and put a bit in a horse's mouth, it doesn't go very well. You have to keep at it. Try it again and again. And rudders don't easily move ships. It takes a while. And that small blaze that starts a whole new cleansing, refreshing fire that's also scary starts small. What if our bit, our rudder, our spark as Jesus' followers is the cross? Not in the Roman way of power and intimidation and coercion, but in the way of Jesus and his love for us. So as we look for how to make sense of the world, as we look for how to know who to love and how to be in relationship with, we use the bit of the cross, the rudder of the cross, to steer us in our lives with one another. Not just here, not just when we see one another, but when we see any of God's beloved people everywhere. It's as if Jesus is walking with us in that place and says to you and me, who do you say that I am? And we can't always give that perfect confirmation answer, if you will. But we can say, you and your cross, well, you're a bit in my mouth and a rudder on my life, and I don't know exactly how it's going to work, but when you summon me, Lord Jesus, to live in response to your unconditional love and grace and follow you in the way of your redemptive love at the cross.